I've been sitting here with my head down, staring at the mic for hours, wondering where to begin this story I need to tell you, in order for the rest of the shows that are going to follow make any kind of sense. When I have patients come into my office, they often say the same thing. They often don't know where to begin. Sometimes to begin feels overwhelming for all of us, myself included. I always tell them, just start anywhere. We'll find our way. I need to take my own advice here and just jump right in, even if I'm risking my career to tell this story. So yeah, that's what's coming up today on Unscripted. Hey guys, welcome back. I'm so glad and grateful you're joining me for episode number 4. I can't believe it, episode number 4 already of Unscripted, a podcast all about living life unscripted in all kinds of ways. I'm your host, Nell Daly, and today I'm going to be telling you a very personal story in order to prepare you for what I have coming up later this week. Yeah, this week we're going to release 2 episodes, one on Monday and one on Wednesday. Wednesday will be what I call the big show, the interview show. And this week we have on someone who, frankly, is so impressive and courageous. I can't believe I actually got to talk to her for an hour. Jill Willard. If you've heard of her, you know I can't say enough good things about the work she's doing in this world. If you haven't heard of her yet, well, hold on. Your entire life is about to change. Yep, I know that's a big statement, but it's totally true. And you'll understand why when you keep listening. The interview I did with Jill is brilliant. In fact, after listening to the recording again, after we did it, I actually realized it was even more brilliant than I originally thought when it was happening. But again, in order for the interview to make sense to all of you, I need to tell you a little bit more about my personal story first, which leads me to today, right now, staring at this mic, not knowing where to start. As you guys can already tell who've listened to other episodes, this show, Unscripted, is about inspiring people to not just exist, but to live. Really live. It's also intended to be disruptive. And some things that are disruptive feel uncomfortable, to say the least, to learn about at first. There's a great quote that I want to share with you guys. Enlightenment is a destructive process. It has nothing to do with becoming better or being happier. Enlightenment is the crumbling away of untruth. It's seeing through the facade of pretense. It's the complete eradication of everything we imagined to be true. And that's by this amazing spiritual writer named Adyashanti. Today's episode might also make some of you uncomfortable. It certainly in the past has made me really, really uncomfortable to talk about in public. As you'll hear in my interview with Jill, I've been warned not to talk about what I'm going to tell you, that in fact, I've had publishers and friends and producers tell me that this may discredit me or ruin my career. But again, we can't go any further together with the science behind all the stuff I'm really passionate about if you don't understand the story behind it first. And frankly, I'm more concerned about understanding and getting to the truth than being popular or accepted. So I and we have hit a crossroads. And I think one of the reasons I'm more uncomfortable telling my story than telling other people's stories is because for the last, over a decade, I've listened to other people's stories, and it hasn't necessarily been about my story. So for those of you who listened to my pre-episode, you know that last winter I began to seriously reconsider the way I approach my life's work. I began to deeply question conventional medicine and dive into other quote-unquote alternative therapies. For those of you who didn't listen to it, I really encourage you to go back and download it. It's only about 16 minutes long, and it will begin to illuminate some of the things I'm trying to get out for today. So I left a couple of things out of that pre-episode that are now important to tell. And I'm going to tell you something that I didn't tell people for a very long time that was happening to me. I guess you could call this a secret that I kept just to myself. For years in my office, when I would be working with a patient and maybe they were sharing something that they had never told anyone else before, or they were coming to some profound insight that we both knew was going to completely shift their perspective on things, I would see the light change in the room. It was a subtle thing. It was like a glow, like a warm haze that would float in slowly from no place in particular. And it was this really soft and beautiful light. And it would hang there between the two of us like mist for a few minutes, and then dissipate like mist does when the sun burns it off. I could tell that the person who was sitting in the room with me didn't see it, so I never told anyone. This phenomenon never scared me. I just thought, maybe this is all in my head, but it's pleasant enough. Duly noted, I would say to myself, and then I would simply let the experience go. The only other time I remember seeing anything like it before was at my best friend's father's funeral when we were just 20 years old. Her father had died suddenly of a massive heart attack. And when she got up to give the eulogy at the church, she was surrounded by a halo of bright white light. I turned to the friends sitting next to me and asked them if they could see it too, but everyone, through tears and tissues, just shook their heads and quietly said no. So I let it go, but I never forgot it. But as I kept doing the work of a therapist, I found my intuition was getting stronger and stronger. In just a few minutes, I knew things about people and their feelings before they even told me. The best way to describe it, I interpret their story, their being, from a different place within me, from my being. Not from my head, as I had been trained, but from my heart or my gut, from what I would later call a different place of consciousness. And I saw the light around them, an aura, an energy I could, quote unquote, read if I allowed myself to. I could turn this off and on depending on how I felt that day to all of this. Then one day in the fall of 2016, a colleague of mine named Dr. Kelly Brogan asked me to go to a Kundalini yoga class with her in downtown Manhattan. I had actually never heard of Kundalini at this point before, but I think that she's brilliant and I'm a total gamer. So I was like, yeah, I'll totally go with you. For those of you who don't know about Kundalini yet, and we'll get into that in a show coming up very soon, it's a very spiritually based yoga practice. After Kundalini, she whisked me into an Uber and took me directly into a class being held in a building near the Flatiron by a man named Joseph Aldo. Joseph Aldo, she said in the car, was a spiritual teacher who was going to teach us all about consciousness. I didn't know what to expect, but what I saw, what I walked into that classroom, certainly broke down tons of preconceived notions about what I thought a spiritual teacher would look like. He was this impeccably well-dressed man in beautiful leather shoes. His white button-down shirt was pressed. The room was filled with New York City professionals. I couldn't believe it. I was like, where did this subculture come from? Doctors and designers, there was a banker there, those who looked like graphic artists and entrepreneurs. And then there was Joseph in front of a whiteboard talking about how we reach higher levels of consciousness. As I sat, transfixed by the scene unfolding in front of me, I love subcultures, the light changed in the room. I noticed it. I took a deep breath in and cast my eyes towards the window just to make sure it wasn't the sun going down. No, it had already been dark for hours. Then, 1 minute later, Joseph Aldo said, "Did anyone else just see the light change in the room?" At that point, to be honest with you, I thought I was going to throw up. To witness something paranormal is one thing, and I use that word paranormal with a little bit of trepidation because I think it has a lot of connotations to it. To witness something paranormal is one thing. To have someone else see it with you is something else. And I use that word paranormal with some level of trepidation here because I think that comes with a lot of connotations. You can no longer just tell yourself you're crazy and move on. And as I told you just a moment ago, I suddenly felt sick. After the class, Kelly and some of her friends asked if I would go to dinner with them. I quietly excused myself and walked east towards the subway. I wanted to get on Metro North. I wanted to get home to the man I was engaged to at the time. But on the way, I stopped. I was so shaken that I stopped at the closest bar I could find, which actually happened to be, of all places, a California pizza kitchen. And I sat at the bar and ordered a drink. And for those of you listening to this who are New Yorkers, that's like a pretty funny image because we don't normally go into chain restaurants when there's like a million other kinds of awesome bars in New York City. But there I was sitting at a California pizza kitchen, drinking by myself at the bar. And I never drink by myself ever. It's just not something I've ever done. And I had 2 really strong glasses of tequila and knew from some deep place inside of me that things would never be the same again. Now looking back, all the signs had already been there for a while. I don't know why I hadn't just copped to them earlier. For example, I had had a few patients over the years play me recorded cell phone conversations they had had with mediums. I was especially intrigued by one man in particular, a medium named Thomas John, who kept popping up. But again, and I thought they were all credible, this information never scared me. I wasn't scared until I realized I might have the ability to do some of this stuff myself. The analytical side of my brain, the science, the academic, the conventionally trained therapist side of my brain kicked in that night at the California Pizza Kitchen, and I started to question everything that had just happened to me. With the same vigor and tenacity I used to solve any problem that doesn't make sense to my mind. What was all of this about? And down the rabbit hole I went. Because part of me truly was worried I was dreaming, or worse, that I had actually lost my mind. This takes a lot of courage for me to talk about. I had no language, none, to understand my experience. I didn't know what an intuitive healer was. I had never been to a spiritual teacher before. I had never heard of people who call themselves light workers. The only psychics I had met were the ones who had stands up at some of the children's fairs I took my children to. I needed to understand what was happening to me. So I did what I always do when I'm confused. I hit the library. I read. And I read a ton about the metaphysical world and Buddhism. I read about neuroscience and past life regression therapy. And I went to see Joseph Aldo in Brooklyn where he lived. He was one of many that I searched out over the last year, one of many people that I asked for answers and explanations. Oftentimes, as we all know, this is going to be very obvious for me to say, there are very negative connotations and stereotypes around psychics and mediums and angel workers and channelers and even sometimes spiritual gurus. But part of those connotations are centered in this false notion that what they're doing isn't based on some level in science. If you think this is a big leap, what I'm telling you, I get it. So let me slow it down for you. This is part of what I had to learn last year as well. We're at such an interesting time in world history. I just did an interview with a guy named Brett King for another show, and he's a futurist, an author of, I believe, 5 books. He's an inventor. His app is now used by major banks, and he's a very well-respected international speaker on the fintech industry. We were talking about how we're going to see more change in the next 5 to 10 years than we have in the last 250 because the world is moving at such a fast pace. Because of advances in technology and medicine and science, we now have the ability to study things we could never measure before. And this is the wild edge I'm seriously interested in. Like, for example, can VR technology be used to cure cancer? For those of you who don't know what VR is, they're those glasses that you put on your face that it's basically like a computer, but they're glasses, and they make you feel like you're in a video game. Can we use those glasses to manipulate parts of the brain, to trigger parts of our consciousness, to heal ourselves from things like cancer? This is being studied at major universities. Neuroscientists know now that meditation opens up places in the prefrontal cortex. Opening that space up has tons of healing effects on the body. It calms the parasympathetic nervous system, it reduces blood pressure and cortisol levels. But what else can it do? Another way that tech and medicine and science are all coming together, we can also now measure people's electromagnetic field and draw some conclusions from that data about those people and their behaviors and their health. Over the last 10 years, as a society, we've started adopting more and more ancient Eastern practices into our everyday lives. I always think that I look back on our lives and I think, oh my God, our parents didn't even know what yoga was when we were growing up, right? Yoga wasn't a part of our culture. If you're my age, that is, which is post 40. And now, because we have the ability to scientifically measure the benefit of these things, these more ancient Eastern practices in the West, we are. Said another way, Eastern practices are what have been considered more mystical experiences or plant medicines that have been used for thousands of years by indigenous peoples, but were not used by modern Americans for medicinal purposes until more recently in history, are now being scientifically studied at a greater rate, thank God, because we're making huge strides in the medical community. Just think about how people who can take little bits of THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, helps people with Parkinson's disease, for example. The alternative spiritual world is starting to become more and more mainstream and accepted, which is amazing. Recently, I found out that Oprah actually did a show with Dr. Brian Weiss, who wrote this incredible book called Many Lives, Many Masters, which is about past life regression therapy. His book has sold millions of copies and has been translated into dozens of languages. And I believe that the show he did with Oprah actually won an Emmy. I could be wrong about that, but I think I saw that somewhere. So what are we looking at here? We're beginning as a society to open up. We are beginning to delve into one of the most mysterious and baffling places we can venture in a completely new way. And that place is the scientific study of what constitutes human consciousness, higher consciousness, collective consciousness, and universal consciousness or energy. Talking about consciousness for many reasons triggers lots of people in the scientific and medical community who aren't ready to listen to this. For all sorts of reasons, all of which would be way too confusing for me to get into here on this episode, but believe me, I will in future episodes. But just to dip your toe in the water, if this word consciousness is new to you, I seriously suggest that everyone listening to this right now, at some point in your day, watch a fascinating TED Talk that was done by an incredibly intelligent writer and what I would call a social scientist. He did a TED Talk called The War on Consciousness, and TED actually banned it, which I really have no idea why. Well, I say that now as I study consciousness and what raising our collective consciousness can do to certain industries, I do understand why TED banned it. But I just didn't think TED did stuff like ban TED Talks. So I'm kind of happy that they did, though, because when something is threatening to the status quo, it actually usually gets a lot more press when it's banned. And his work is worthy of all of our attention. So I think it got even more attention because it was banned. You need to watch it. It's worth it. And watch it to the end. It's not just a talk on ayahuasca, which is what he starts with. Okay, so where does this leave us today, right now? And what have you learned in the last few minutes about all of this stuff and me? Probably some stuff that you didn't expect. I've only recently begun to call myself an intuitive therapist. I don't consider myself a psychic or a medium, although as you'll continue to learn more and more about me from episode to episode, I believe in them, and I believe we all have the ability to hone and strengthen our intuition, which for some of us can lead to mediumship as we practice using it more and more. And you'll hear more of my experience of opening up to my own intuition as we go. Before I end this episode, I just want to take a few minutes and tell you about Jill Willard, our amazing guest for Wednesday's show, and why I believe her work in particular is so important for us to learn about. Jill Willard is the author of the book Intuitive Being, which was published by HarperCollins in 2016. Jill, as she will explain to us on Wednesday, was born with a unique ability for predicting the future and intuiting the experiences of others. She's also a medium, and in addition to giving readings to clients, she has trained corporate executives, pro athletes, and other thought leaders in honing their intuitive skills. Jill's work has appeared in Goop and Vanity Fair, Elle, Women's Health, Well and Good, and on Mind Body Green. She is the co-founder of Intuitive Meditation and lives in Manhattan Beach, California, with her husband, who's a broadcaster, and 3 children. Jill's book on being argues this main principle: we can all learn to tap into our intuition, and then the book shows us how. After doing this work, meaning the work of a psychotherapist for over a decade, I can't stress to you enough how valuable, let me be more clear, crucial it is that we all learn to understand intuition and use it in our everyday lives. Just a quick aside here, there's a history in this country of women in particular being interested in spiritualism, and we'll get to that on another episode. But what I've seen over the last few years, and I've had other therapists and psychotherapists and healers tell me the same thing, that men are opening up to these ideas more and more, and that's a beautiful thing to see. According to the first page of Jill's book, intuition is, quote, a knowing, but a different kind of knowing than the purely physical, mental, academic knowledge we tend to focus on in the Western world. She goes on to say, one of the biggest hurdles to accessing our intuition is believing that it exists and giving credence to those little nudges and signs and insights that seem to come without logical explanation. And those signs can come in many forms, as she says, and I'm paraphrasing here. They can come in roaring like a tornado, like a strong gut feeling that you should avoid something, or a slight whisper, or what's called a synchronicity or mediumship, which is, for those of you who don't know, mediumship is communicating with someone who has already crossed over into another dimension. For me, intuition shows up the most as these synchronicities, a word that I had to learn when I started this journey a year ago. I had no idea when people said synchronicities what they were talking about. I literally was like, what? Throughout the day. Many of us chalk up these unexplainable coincidences or a series of events that might happen to us that don't quite make sense. It's just weird. But I assure you they are not. At least I don't think so. And I'm a reluctant spiritualist, as you can tell. This other world that I'm now a part of took years to win me over, as you've just learned. So why talk about intuition? Why talk about intuitive healers and psychics and mediums on a show like Unscripted? Because as Dr. Julie Holland says at the end of her episode, an interview with me, which was about the birth control pill and antidepressants that we aired last week, she sees her in her office, and I totally agree with her, that we suffer with an individual and collective malaise if we don't feel connected to something, quote unquote, other, whether that be a God or the universe, each other, or a deep part of our own selves. As a society, we've never been so connected, yet so unable to connect. Medication or self-medicating blocks the body from hearing that inner voice that you need to hear, which guides you. Sorrow takes our souls on a journey, for example, back to ourselves. As Francis Weller says, we meet our souls at the shrine of grief. If we can't feel grief, we won't kneel at the shrine and commune with our souls. If we don't know our soul's deepest longings, if we can't hear what Elizabeth Lesser calls the knocking at our souls, we've lost the line of communication to our intuition, which is the internal and external guidance system we're all born with, that is there to help us navigate our lives and live out our most true intentions. So let's break this down and get practical for a second, because I know for some of you that might have sounded really high level or esoteric. People come into my office with some level of dysthymia or anxiety or depression. They say to me, I really hate my job, but the problem is I don't really know what I want to do with my life. How do I figure that out? The first thing I tell them to do is to meditate, because they really know they just can't hear it anymore. They can't step into their dharma, their soul's work, if they don't know what that dharma is. And the quickest way to figuring out your dharma is simply by being quiet, by meditating and listening to the soul. What does your gut say? I often ask them, and they turn to me and say, I don't know. And that's the problem. People have cut themselves off from their intuition. They can't hear their intuition speaking to them anymore, especially if they're self-medicating or on psychiatric medications. After they learn to listen to their intuition, the next step is whether or not someone has the courage to step into it, to step into their soul's longings. So another example of this would be, my intuition is telling me, for example, I shouldn't be with a certain man. Now, do I have the courage? Am I brave enough to leave him? But that's a slightly separate matter, which we will get to at some point, I'm sure. Lastly, without a spiritual belief system of some sort, start with this. Spiritual belief systems can be religious, but they don't have to be. What I'm talking about here, what I'm arguing, is that without some belief in a universal system of interconnectedness, we feel too separate from ourselves, our loved ones, and the world. And that's when we feel most symptomatic and alone and anxious and depressed. So that's part of my story. Did I discredit myself here? I don't think so. Because I know intuitively, deep down, what I've been experiencing and used to hide from the world is also happening to you or your sister or your best friend or your husband. We're all just too afraid to say anything, because for many of us, the social circles we're a part of wouldn't accept it. I'm going to leave you all now with one of my favorite quotes that you've already heard me say once before. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And I'm sure, again, I butchered his name, because even though I took, 9 years of French, I'm still terrible at it. So guys, that's the story that I needed to tell you today. Thank you so much for listening. I'm beyond grateful that I had the opportunity to share it and be of service. To continue this discussion, please join us over at Daily Unscripted, which is a private Facebook group where we are already gathering a tribe, which is so cool, to continue this kind of conversation. I'll be checking in to answer more questions and exchange ideas for those of you who are intrigued about what it means to live a life unscripted. And please, please, please email me at nell@thedaily.com with questions or guest ideas or thoughts. And also, you can follow our comings and goings, and mine in particular, on Instagram at Nell Daly, and that's at Nell Daly, NELLDALY. And you can check out more about us at thedaily.com. Until Wednesday, may the light in me shine to the light in you. Peace out, guys.